We are looking at the divided kingdom, not the united kingdom, but the divided kingdom of Israel, which occurred after the death of Solomon. It was prophesied that this was going to happen, that the kingdoms would be split. And that prophecy came to pass. Not only that, but it was also prophesied that the people to the north would be carried away and scattered, and the people to the south would spend 70 years in Babylon's captivity there. Now, where there are a lot of just things that bug me, and I'm saying this repeatedly, people seem to come to this conclusion that somehow when we are dealing with people called the lost tribes of Israel, there is this automatic supposition that these all have to be Jewish people, and I cannot say this enough, they are not. Now, we have looked at the tribe of Dan, and we have seen unequivocally, they pretty much tell the story of most of the northern tribes, that over time, as it was prophesied in the Bible, they would forget over time their worship practices, their origin, everything that went with what was so deeply rooted in oral tradition, they would forget. Now I ask you a question, because people tend to be silly with this. It's easy for us to say, I remember my mother or my father, and I may even go so far as to say, I do remember my grandmother and my grandfather, but beyond that, it's very difficult, unless you are one of those very fortunate people to have a great-great-grandmother or a great-great-grandfather alive when you were younger. Usually, most of that information from that generation I'm looking at is lost. Even your grandparents probably didn't tell you everything about their parents. So by 2 generations, just in our modern time, and we've got technology to help us remember, but 2 generations is about all you're going to be able to really latch onto. And if you really want to go the distance, because these were oral tradition people, maybe 3 generations at best. So this becomes important because a lot of people don't understand as these people began to migrate, and some of them began to migrate before they went into Egypt's bondage. As these people began to migrate, they commingled. They did not stay within their pure tribes, if you will. They broke up into, we'll call it, many different clans. And those clans, with great likelihood, commingled because, think about it, 3 or 4 generations down the pipeline, you're no longer remembering your worship practices. Even the language may have been forgotten as people begin to move. Specifically, people who need to survive, who need to trade with other people who may not share the same language. You start looking at the area in which these people began to move, not so much those that moved on sea, but those that moved on land would have encountered other peoples not speaking the same language, not having the same customs. So it becomes very clear there is no way to say here is a pure line of people with each and every one of these that we've looked at so far. It is very, very difficult to find a pure blood descendant, if you will, because ultimately people commingled and co-married. And that's what we've been trying to sort out here. Now I believe this is the 19th message on the subject of the lost tribe. So we are having to play time detective a bit. Some of these tribes are a little more ambiguous in the breadcrumbs they left. Nevertheless, we're able to trace and show where these people are deported and dumped into certain buffer zones. And for all intents and purposes, people would say, well, these people just disappeared. Well, you explain to me how a whole mass of people, about the same number, reappear in that very area where those people disappeared and were known by another name. Well, we know how that happened. For example, the Assyrian records tell us that they were known by many names. The Assyrians labeled the people, for example, Saka Suni. They labeled them Beit Umri. They gave them certain names that were attached from the book. Saka Suni, sons of Isaac. Beit Umri, from the house of Omri. So when we see this in the secular records, we have great understanding. The names were put onto them a lot of times by their deporters, and sometimes even as they began to migrate, they would be known by other people, not the same tribe, not the same clan. They would be referred to, or they'd get their name from somebody else, sometimes by their habits, sometimes by their language. So it's important to sort all this out. Now, today we will be focusing on the tribe of Naphtali. And if you want to turn with me, I'll show you, we're going to start looking at the biblical record first, as we've been doing every week. So Genesis 30 is where you have the list of all the children born to Jacob, who is Israel, and the 4 women that bore these children: Rachel, Leah, and their 2 handmaids, Bilhah and Zilpah. So in Genesis 30 and verses 7 and 8, it says, "And Bilhah, Rachel's maid, conceived again and bare Jacob a 2nd son. And Rachel said, With great wrestlings I have wrestled with my sister, and I have prevailed. And she called his name Naphtali." Now, if you look in the margins, if you have a Bible like mine, Hebrew says wrestling of God, or my wrestling. So that is one interpretation of the name. We've got another place where we can glean a little bit about Naphtali, a little bit further on in Genesis 49. And that is where Jacob, Israel, is pronouncing blessings or prophetic words on each of the children. And that is 49, Genesis 49 and verse 21 says, "Naphtali is a hind let loose. He giveth goodly words." Short and sweet, huh? Not too much more. Now, in a few chapters back in Genesis, actually I'll make you turn there so you could see it for yourself. In 46 and 24, you'll read about the sons of Naphtali. And the sons of Naphtali, Jazeel and Guni, Jezer and Shillim. I feel bad for the second kid, Guni. Yeah, meet my kid, Guni. All right, so if you have noticed a pattern, what I have shown you, a lot of these names that we read will coincide with either places or clan names of people later on who become a people well known to us. For example, Jazeel will be associated with the Zeeland of Denmark with ties to Holland. Guni with ties to the journey of Batavia, Jezer connected to Denmark as well. So why am I pointing all this out? I like to give you that information so you can kind of see where we're pointed towards, but this is a little bit more confusing because you're going to see how much, again, there's this great spread that it would be very hard to say great concentrations here, but we'll try and sort this out. Now, Moses also had words for each of the heads or tribes. You'll find that in Deuteronomy 33 and 23. "And of Naphtali he said, O Naphtali, satisfied with favor and full with the blessing of the Lord, possess thou the west and the south." What a strange blessing. Now, we'll have to look at where they ended up in the most concentration to see if that is a prophetic word to the land that they will settle in, the bulk of them, concentration. In the first census that is taken, we have the record of this tribe being 53,400. And then we have another record where it seems the number is reduced by some 8,000 men. And what that could mean in the wilderness, if you know your Bible, it could mean that these are people that were exposed to either plague or other things that we know about. But it's kind of interesting when you see how the people either prospered and multiplied. In this case, the numbers are not too bad. They're a decent-sized tribe. Now, what we can glean in certain areas, and there are some things that are not so interesting. For example, we have in Numbers 2:29, the captain of the children of Naphtali shall be Ahira, the son of Enan. But we don't have a full genealogy. So actually, if you went through the Bible, you could piecemeal with probably some missing names in there, but you could piecemeal enough information regarding this tribe to build actually and fill out more of the children of Naphtali than is recorded in the order that is given. Now to the land allotment that was given to them. So that you'll find in Joshua 19. Naphtali's portion of the land. The sixth lot came to the children of Naphtali, even for the children of Naphtali according to their families. And their coast was from Heleph, from Alon to Ze-Naimim, Adami, Nekeb, Jabneel, unto Lukum, and outgoings thereof were at Jordan. And if you read the whole spread here, you're going to see something very interesting. Kadesh, Edrei, and Hazor, some of these are familiar. So if you were to look on a map, what you would see, they're inland. They're not a coastal tribe per se. They sit kind of, there's one tribe, and then there's one tribe coastal, and then they're right there. However, the area that they had, which would have been somewhere around 800, I believe, square miles, would have been ideal for tending flock and shepherding sheep, because you had these hidden springs that trickled down from Mount Hermon. You had the Sea of Galilee, and as you read here, the border of the Jordan River. So that's a lot of water. If you're wondering, it's kind of interesting and very important, by the way. We know that most of these tribes, most of them, well, they all had to raise their own livestock. So imagine if you're the guy who's got the water. Pretty important there. But the reason why I say take a look at where they are is also, there's also good reason. Let's see if we've got our handy-dandy picture from the Bible here. Let's take a look. So you can see Naphtali is right here. You've got two bodies of water, and then Mount Hermon up here, so the hidden springs coming from Mount Hermon, the Sea of Galilee. You've got enough to see, and as I said, Asher's the coastal dweller here, but what's important is take a look at what the northern part, to the tip almost of Sidon, which is very important and in close proximity to Tyre. And the reason why I point that out is, once more, people who would be at least minimally exposed to their neighbors, especially those people who were proficient at building ships. And it is not an accident that the tribe of Naphtali has, you'd think it would be Dan, you'd think it would be Asher, but it's Naphtali's symbol of the boat. That is their symbol. I haven't done this, but each of the tribes has something attached to them, like Dan is the serpent. You've got each one of these has an animal, they've got representations, colors, emblems, if you will. So I think it's interesting that Naphtali is a boat. That's kind of an interesting one. it became that their eventual national emblem would change into something else, because I haven't gotten to the nation yet, so forgive me. Now, in terms of looking at a little bit better understanding of this tribe, we want to look, interestingly enough, into the book of Judges. And the reason there is pretty clear if you've hung around any amount of time here. The book of Judges has the record before there were kings ruling in Israel. People were appointed from respective tribes to judge, to rule, to give guidance. So if you were just looking at, for example, and I started going through these, if you were in the 3rd chapter, for example, Othniel is from the tribe of Judah, and Ehud would be from the tribe of Benjamin. So it seems very axiomatic. I did this before years ago. You may have notes in your Bible about this, but there's a great reason to believe that Deborah heralded from the tribe of Naphtali. There's good reason to believe that. Now, what's interesting here is a battle is going to ensue. And I've referenced lightly some of the problems we've encountered, for example, with Dan, and I believe Asher's the same thing. While the call for help to come to aid in the battle, 2 of the tribes they're not bothering to come to the aid, they're just doing their own thing. What is important, though, is you're going to read Deborah calls a man named Barak, and he is going to lead the charge. And if you look there in verse 10, 4:10, Judges 4:10, and Barak called Zebulun and Naphtali to Kadesh, and he went up with 10,000 men at his feet, and Deborah went up with him. So it's kind of interesting. You can see right here Zebulun and Naphtali to Kadesh. And I think what is important here is these people belonging to this tribe, for whatever the reason, they didn't cower, they didn't back away, they were in the battle, no questions asked. If you want to read it on your own, because it's not part of what I'm doing, but if you want to read this section on your own to get clarity of what's involved here, I highly recommend that you do. Now, from this, there are several things that we can glean, and they don't become obvious immediately. But what we glean from Deborah and from those who answered the call, we see courage, we see the ability to fight. They're not cowards, they're not in their ships, they're not doing other things, they're not making excuses. They are there. And probably one of the most important things that's not written here, you won't find it here, but it becomes important when you're looking at the tribes per se. We just looked at the birth record. And the birth record itself, there's nothing remarkable to say, oh, something special happened here. But what is important is that Naphtali and Dan are biological tribesmen brothers, okay? That's important. And it's not as though this is going to make or break anybody's theology, but I want you to think of it this way. The reason why this is important is because later we are going to see Naphtali ending up in places with Dan, and it seems pretty clear to me that although they will forget their background and they will forget a lot of things, you know, sometimes there's something, that inner whatever it is, that draws you to somebody and you don't know why. And I think this might be the case here, where two groups of people did not know that they were biologically back in the woodpile related, but they ended up somehow always in the same environs together. And I don't think that's an accident. You get further along and you get into 1 Chronicles, and I mentioned this last week regarding the coronation of David, and you will find that the largest amount of his supporters gathered at Hebron, the largest contingents, if you will, Zebulun, Asher, and Naphtali. And I think that's equally important because it showed their allegiance to David as a leader and people who were able to follow somebody committedly. In 1 Chronicles 27, we have a list of the tribal leaders of Naphtali. And there's mention of a few people that you might say, well, is this noteworthy? It's just in mention. Jeremoth, the son of Azriel. And so if you, as I said, if you were to do some real hard digging, and I think you could do this with every single tribe, you begin to pull the names out. Now, not all of these names will appear morphed into countries or rivers or other peoples, but this is the reason for going back and looking at these genealogies. We can pull out and we can see names that are immediately connected, some that are not. Now we know that the people of Naphtali were carried away. The Bible says in the days of Pekah, king of Israel, came Tiglath-Pileser of Assyria and took Ijon and Abel-Beth-Maachah and Genoa and Kadesh and Hazor and Gilead and Galilee and the land of Naphtali and carried them away into Assyria. The parallel passage, 1 Chronicles 5:26, if you were reading that, does not mention Naphtali. But if you look at the map, it seems like a no-brainer that they were part and parcel. So one record includes it, one record does not. There is an interesting reference, by the way, if you are into reading the Apocryphal, the book of Tobit, and this is important because it tells you the area that they were dumped into. And in the area of Media, where they were dumped into, these people are also going to be known. I'm going to give you a whole host of names, but they'll be known, these people from Naphtali will be known as the Cadusi, the Cadusa, or the Cadusei. Now let me do the dump right here because I'm going to just get all the names out as much as I can, and then you'll say, okay, I can start putting this together. So the Naphtalites, we will encounter them as the White Huns. Do not confuse these with the Huns that everybody's heard of, Attila the Hun. The people that were associated and descendants of Attila the Hun are different than White Huns. Do not make them the same people. They are not. By the way, a couple of historians chronicled and said the White Huns were much more attractive to look on than the other Huns. I don't know what the meaning is there, but you're all intelligent people. Take and do with it what you want. That's to say that maybe the Attila Huns were ugly. All right. These people will also be called Thasagetai, which sounds a little bit like Masagetai, right? Thasagetai, if it sounds familiar, it's very interesting. The Thasagetai are, in our terms, little Goths, okay? All from the tribe of Naphtali. Then you've got, as I mentioned, the Kadase, the Cadusi, the Huones, the Hunas, the Sigins, the Sequanis, the Segi, the Sigs, also sometimes identified as the Hephalites or the Hephalites. Wait, there's more. They were also known as Vikings, and I'll now get into bifurcating the Vikings a little bit in a minute. Chinese historians refer to these people, the Naphtali people, as Yetai or Hua. And it's believed that that's where the Hun name came from. That I cannot tell you for certain, okay? But we will see the bulk of these people in Norway and Sweden. And when we begin to look at the migration patterns, it becomes more and more clear that we can at least know where the bulk of these people will settle. Famed cartographer Ortelius recorded a tradition that, quote, the Danarum and the Nephatelim were the White Huns according to his map of Tartaria. Now, there is a big controversy whether these people were nomadic or not, and I believe that at least a good portion of them initially were and had to be nomadic, warring, and no one really can say otherwise. There are enough historical records to say these people had, wait for it, light blue eyes, light hair, and light skin. So, don't go stereotyping. A lot of people think all these people had to be dark-haired. They all had this similar stereotype, the same thing of grouping everybody into one lump sum. These were light and fair people, and that is what history shows. In 2007, Professor Paul Harrison of Stanford University deciphered a copper scroll from Afghanistan that dates to the early 490s AD, and it is from a people known as the Hephalites. Now, there is great controversy over this, because there is a group of people out there that completely say the Hephalites cannot be the Naphthalites. Well, I have an issue with that, okay? It's just too darn close, number one. And number two, I cannot find the people who would be the Hephalites as anything other than the people of the tribe of Naphtali, all right? If you go on the record looking for this tribe, for example, I believe it is Britannica Online, says, yes, these people are part of the tribe, and then they turn around and they contradict themselves in one fell swoop by saying, oh, it actually was a typo and not part of whatever. I'm sorry. That's too convoluted for me. If you're looking at most of the historical records, I believe the Hephalites are indeed the people we're calling the tribe of Naphtali as well. Now, it's unclear. Again, no two scholars agree on this. They have found traces of people within the clans of Naphtali. Does not mean they themselves practice Buddhism, but they found a lot of Buddhist practices in and around the environs where these people were. The only thing is that we know the record shows that they practiced worship that is from Iran, which would be none other than Zoroastrianism. Now, why do I say that and introduce that here? Hold your thoughts on this, because this one is a doozer. So, in your own time, and I'm sure you will find enough conflicting and contradicting information on this, but if you look up the origins and the beginning of Zoroastrianism, it seems as though not the religion as it developed later, but in its initial inception was monotheistic, didn't possess, it basically became paganized later, and has a lot in common with Judaism, interestingly enough. So there's a great controversy, and this one I'm not going to even get into. I'm just going to put it out there for you who are curious and like controversy. There is good reason to believe that one group may have borrowed from the other back, and while we're looking at the Bible, we have a written record. Well, don't be so quick to think that maybe there weren't influences from one side or the other, because we know that over time, Zoroastrianism basically morphs into a complete pagan religion and goes from the area of Iran and is brought into the areas, for example, of India and China, at least in the high mountainous areas. But you can definitely see that this religion became hijacked and turned completely pagan. I think that there were influences, definitely as a monotheistic religion, there were definitely influences there that morphed over time. That becomes important for another reason, because if we're actually trying to, like time detectives, trace people, sometimes we're not able to find DNA. Sometimes we're only able to find relics and remains of religious practices in areas that we should not find these particular objects. That also helps us to understand something else was going on here. So, now back to history. Procopius of Caesarea in the 6th century was a historian who wrote the history of the wars, and I quote, says, "The Hephalites are of the stock of the Huns who are called White Huns. In fact, as well as name, however, they do not mingle with any of the Huns known to us. for they occupy a land neither adjoining nor even very near to them, but their territories lie directly to the north of Persia. Indeed, their city called Gorgo is located over against the Persian frontier and is consequently the center of frequent contests concerning boundary lines between the two peoples. The historian also said they did not make an incursion into Roman territory except in the company of the Median army. Also, these people observed some form of a governing constitution and eventually were ruled by a king. So don't think, a lot of times we think tribes and we think, barbaric. We have the Hollywood unfortunate stereotype of a lot of these things, which are not true. Some of these people were incredibly advanced. When I use the word technology, you might go, eh? But technology, you tell me how. And I'm not necessarily saying strictly Naphtali, but for example, we know the tribe of Dan, because of their exposure, how their craftsmanship in metals and glass and things that are so far advanced for their time. When we talk about ages, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, and people forget that that's speaking of what was introduced into that segment of time. You're talking about people who had knowledge of things before these timelines were identified as they are today. And you tell me that's not some advanced mindset. And no, I'm not going to tell you that they were aliens, because they were not. Their burial customs share very much with, like Dan, burying people under mounds of dirt, and usually it would be earth and then stone on top, and their partner or companions would be placed close by. So the idea of not burning bodies, which becomes important because you begin to see how they understood even death and dying, which is a whole different subject, but still very important. Hephalite was the name given by the Byzantine historians as well as the Persian writers. See what I'm telling you? So if somebody's looking this up and they say the Naphtali and the Hephalites, and it becomes confusing. All you have to remember is that these people, much like the rest of these clans and tribes, would be known by so many different names until they settle a land. And then that land becomes the representation, like we saw with, for example, Denmark. All right? Now, interesting, these people, Naphtali, I mentioned, will also settle in portions of Denmark, but will they stay there? We'll find out in a minute. Sometime around 330 BC, a Greek chronicler named Pytheas traveled the coast of what is now known to us as Norway. He called the land Thule, Thule. Other historians and scholars have used this same name, Thule, to reference this area. Some have hypothesized that Thule is nothing but an abridged, cut apart, bifurcated name instead of Naphtali, Thule. No, it's very strange how they say that, but I can understand Hebrew versus English. There's a great disconnect, but you could see it probably with the Hebrew. Here's what we do know. The White Huns and the Danes settle both in Norway and Denmark, as I just said. And if you remember, I mentioned the connection of the biological brothers and why this will keep being a reoccurring theme, even right to this level. We have now a better understanding, as we move into this tribe, that there's actually two categories of Vikings. And actually, when we get into it, we'll find there's more than two, but two main categories. The people we call Vikings, Swedish Vikings, went east and invaded in the direction of Russia. Those Norwegian and Danish Vikings went west towards Britain. So we have two different groups, and they will actually not share a lot of the same customs, traditions, and whatnot as they go their respective ways. So it's kind of interesting. We also have another heated controversy among scholars. as to whether or not these people entered India or China. And I can tell you, if you're willing to look and if you're willing to dig into the secular records, there is no controversy. They absolutely did, okay? And we saw that again with the Scythians. Here is no different. And I'm telling you something really kind of baffling. It's almost as though it is preferred to cover all this up and not discuss it because it would represent these people fanning out into the then known world, every area that you could conceive of, they fanned out into. The problem is that that really ruffles the feathers of folks who have written their history nice and neatly with a neat little beginning with a neat little mythology that then transfers on eventually to real people. Because if you want to know the truth may not fit into the box that we've all accepted, and that's the bottom line. I showed that to you with the Scythians in India and what happened in China, and well, I'm not done there, but just to tell you, it's a big subject. So what can you do in an hour? We're doing the best I can here. I will not tell you that we can know definitively, for example, when we talk about the Vikings. I will not profess to tell you that we can identify what tribe, for example, if we were trying to identify, everybody knows the name Leif Erikson. If we were trying to identify which exact tribe did he belong to, we could probably do some good guesstimating, all right? But what's interesting, if you're just looking at Vikings as a whole, when I say they fanned out into the earth, we know unequivocally that the Vikings were in the Americas 500 years before Columbus. We know that. Now, subsequently, there have been a lot of claims and a lot of artifacts that have been debunked as fraud, but it'd be hard-pressed to debunk all of what was found at L'Anse aux Meadows in Canada. The thing is, when I say how far they fanned out, that really ought to tell you that these people it is as though if we were to just take the globe, every landmass and spread it out, there is no doubt in my mind that whether they made it to landfall or not in many areas, there is absolutely no doubt they were in the North America, and there is good reason to believe, even though many of the places in New England have been debunked as fraud or later monuments erected that have no connection to the Vikings. But the reason why I bring this up is it just shows you, it demonstrates to you that we're not talking about people who have no backbone or spine. If you think about it, to leave, and especially from the territory that Leif Erikson left from, and navigate where he did, which are pretty harsh waters, brutal winters, and the ability to survive on I'm not quite sure what, that speaks volumes to me about how the rest of these people may have lived and had their being. Now, the White Huns are said to have raided India. If you read the historical records, it is there within their records, within the Indian Chronicles, about 470 AD, with a white Hun king named Tunjina or Kinjila. We have a record by Chinese chroniclers, or the Chinese chronicler named Sang Yun, who said that the White Huns worshipped something of Iranian origin. So there is enough information to tell us these people in that land were not from that land, and enough information to tell you, as I'm trying to just nail this home, when we say they migrated, that is a mild understatement. Now, if you recall some of the names of the sons, as I said, we know that a lot of these settled in Zealand, Denmark, which is also sometimes called, and I hope I get this right, Sjelin, which has close ties to another Zealand, which is in a province of the Netherlands east of Holland. So if we look, we're going to see the close tribes with Dan right there that settled in none other than Norway. So if we were trying to paint a picture, by the way, of these people, specifically in the Iron Age, we see people there, of course, before then, but a little after this period, we see the expansion of, as I mentioned last week, of Hallstatt, the Hallstatt culture from the south. By 500 BC, which is labeled the Findless Age, due to scant archaeological evidences left behind, to about 100 AD is typically referred to as the Roman Iron Age for that area, being at a high point in trade with coins, glass objects, as well as weapons that a cachet, huge amount, found in Scandinavia. And the issue is that they were not native. These finds were not native to that land. We know that there are many things they brought with them. So it's kind of interesting. By the year 250 AD, we see the use of rune writing prolifically. By 450 AD, Scandinavians return with great wealth and goods, because now trade has, the door of trade, legitimate trade, no longer just going into a village and killing people and then taking their goods, but legitimate trade has actually become a real thing. So they are wealthy now. They've got gold and silver, and they've got treasures from faraway lands. And this is what's interesting. If you kind of know the area I'm talking about, things that we have identified, as I just said, not germane or organic to that land, tell the story in and of itself of how big trade was at a certain point. Now, the lesson here, I'm not even going to get into the Scythians, because there's actually a group of people we can identify, most likely from the tribe of Naphtali, but they are grafted into the Scythians. That we'll leave that kind of as a subject that I have to address as a whole, which, boy, I'm not looking forward to it at all, because it's very complex and not just, it's not, oh, the Scythians, one people. It's a lot with subgroups and subclans. What I'm hoping to show, though, today is it's very clear, and I said this last week and I want to reiterate this, it's very clear that what God was doing when God said these people will be scattered, is God was preparing people in different lands that eventually would be the people that would receive the good news of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And if you begin to look, if you know the story of the spread of Christianity, it becomes abundantly clear that this is all part of God's plan. I want you to think of something. Had these people not been scattered, and these people in their origin, go right back to the beginning, are in a monotheistic religion at the source, at the beginning. Now, that's not to say that later on they didn't worship other gods, because they did, and that's exactly what the Bible said they would do. But my point is, God knew, and I'm not saying it's all wound up either, but God knew that in the hearts of each of these people, there was a place for the seed of the message of Jesus Christ. God was preparing a people. And this is happening over generations and long periods of time, decades, so that when we get to, and I have to address this because it keeps coming up, seemingly every other week I'll have somebody say something regarding this. In the book of Revelation, might as well turn there because I reference it and I've got enough people who don't have Bibles listening to me. In the book of Revelation, in the 7th chapter, if you have a Bible like mine, the header says the 144,000. After these things I saw 4 angels standing on the 4 corners of the earth, holding the 4 winds of the earth, that the wind should not blow on the earth, nor on the sea, nor on any tree. And I saw another angel ascending from the east, having the seal of the living God, and he cried with a loud voice to the 4 angels to whom it was given to hurt the earth and the sea, saying, hurt not the earth, neither the sea, neither the trees, till we have sealed the servants of our God in their foreheads. I heard the number of them which were sealed, and there were sealed 144,000 of all the tribes of the children of Israel. The mistake I am seeing repeatedly, and I just addressed this at the open of my message, These cannot be, and listen carefully, these cannot be Jewish people. Why? Because they are preachers of righteousness. And what do we understand righteousness in the New Testament? What is righteousness in the New Testament? Christ. So I'm getting people saying, well, what about the Jewish people, the 104? They're not. Stop it. Just quit it. What this is, you read carefully. Of the tribe of Judah were sealed 12,000. Of the tribe of Reuben were sealed 12,000. Of the tribe of Gad, sealed 12,000. Of Asher. So must I keep going, or is this abundantly clear? And there, as I said, if you think about it, here's what's interesting. The events of chapter 7, verses 1 through 17, happened between the opening of the 6th and 7th seals. And the 7th seal, if you know your Bible, is silence. There was silence in the heavens about the space of a half an hour. Okay? So it's as if to say, God will call from each of these tribes and will give them an opportunity to preach, as we'll call it the last call, and then there will be silence. Like God gets the last word. And it doesn't end there, but I'm trying to make this point. So I want you to think about this as we've looked, and I'm not, remember I said to you, we have to be very careful. The people who settled, for example, in, we'll call it Denmark, or the people that settled in Switzerland, in Norway, in Ireland, in America, we have to go through all of these to understand where these people will be called from. Not necessarily, and hear me out, it says to hurt not the earth until they have sealed the servants of God in their foreheads. And 144 of these will be called, and they will preach. There's a purpose to this. And if you and I are seeing the same thing, it becomes obvious to me anyway, that when God calls these people, I don't want you to think that God is calling people, for example, from the tribe. You look here, it says the Naphtali are called here in verse 6. Don't immediately think that these are the people that are the original people that were first part of the tribe of Naphtali. Now, is it possible that God could resurrect these people from olden days? That maybe we know from the New Testament, if Christ went and preached to the departed souls. Could these be resurrected saints that he's called and sealed in the forehead? It could be. But the greater likelihood is that these people will herald from every corner of the earth. That makes a little bit more sense to me. They will come from every corner of the earth where they were scattered. They will be brought back to the epicenter to preach the message that people will be able to relate and understand from someone that basically is in their own likeness and tongue. So this becomes one of these, as I said, frustrations of mine to see how people will not understand how this all ties in together. If we're going down the pathway to identify all the peoples of the earth, we know that Magog appears in the table of nations and may or may not be the people who we think they are today, but certainly we know the territory that we will be dealing with when that time comes. No question about it. So it's important to understand every lesson that we're doing lays the foundation. We haven't gotten probably to what I'd call the two big bites out of this, Ephraim and Manasseh. And this is where we begin to see things actually come together a bit more. Now we've still got a few more tribes to look at, but my point is when you start seeing where everyone has been scattered and settled, and then you move on, for example, if you were moving to look at, for example, the tribe of Zebulun. And in Zebulun, we'll find some really fascinating things that will confuse some people because I'll just give you a little heads up. We know that Zebulun has ties to the Netherlands. And we know that when people talk about the Netherlands, it's very hard to not think about this, that before the people from England came on the Mayflower to America, they were in the Netherlands. They settled for several years, actually, before coming here. And that brings up a whole brand new question. If those are the stock of people that came here between Ephraim and Naphtali, then how on earth did we get to Manasseh? Okay, I see a lot of bewilderment, so it's okay, we'll get there eventually. But what I'm trying to get at today, and probably most important, is it becomes very clear that this is not an exercise in looking at history and fun facts or archaeology or linguistics. This is an exercise to show you that where, as I said last week, where these biblical people end, God says, no, the story's not over yet. The story in this book, done for now. But the story is not over yet. Why? Because in the scattering process, go back and reread what the prophet Hosea says. In a place where they were called not my people, they will become known as my people again. Lo-Ami, Ami, where they were called Jezreel, scattered, they will all be brought back. Do not get confused if you're reading online where it says, oh, they've already reunited people from several tribes who've come back to Israel, the state of Israel. These are not those. I'm sorry, there are people that claim to be of the lost tribe, and I could fill in the blanks. I don't want to offend anybody, but these are not those. What we're talking about has not yet happened, and my Bible makes it very, very clear. God is going to use the nations. So the whole epicenter, the battle, if you want to call it, the whole final chapter on the planet, yes, it will take place in Jerusalem. That's the hub right there. We know that. Somebody says, why is Israel so important? Because of that. The prophecy all points, every single prophecy from Isaiah, Daniel, Ezekiel, Revelation, all point to that land, to that place, and say, that's where God said, that is the place. But the nations, and I've been saying this for weeks, the nations will come to the mount and they will worship there. And don't think for a minute that it's simply in this day and age, because we've gone so far away from the original settlers of these lands who, when they accepted and took on Christianity, Christianized a nation, have become in many ways perverted, including, so no one says I'm a hypocrite, including this country. All you have to do is look around and see what's going on, and you have to ask. I'm not saying that everyone in America is godless. No, I didn't say that. But there are a lot of godless people making policies. There are a lot of godless people that are overseeing our schools and a lot of other areas of our life. And there is no God but the politics or the money, and that's it. So I'm not going to stand here and say, oh, we don't have the same problem. No, it's everywhere. And the only thing that we still have as a saving grace, if you will, is neatly embedded on our money until it disappears, is in God we trust, neatly embedded into our documents that specifically identify our freedoms, is the mention of a God and Creator. And I know there are a whole bunch of people that will, just at the sound of that, will just go, oh, I can't stand that, because they'd like to remove it all. Well, sorry, that hasn't happened yet. You might get your way eventually, but it hasn't happened yet. And it'll be people like me and people like you that keep fighting for the right to keep saying, in God we trust, and God bless America, and that God built this country and this land by allowing it to come into existence. We could have been, by the way, we could have been nothing but British subjects in this country. No. But God let it be America. And this is what I'm saying to you. The grace that God has given to put this on display for people who are willing to look and analyze and scrutinize tells me something. God is not only not finished, But if you look at his plan, it's pretty incredible that at the end of time, he includes people from every nation that was scattered to come back and to preach the righteousness that is in Jesus Christ. Now, I don't know about you, but I can say this, I can speak for me. I am so glad that God, those many years ago, woke me up out of a stupor and got my lazy butt to come and sit in church and listen to the message. That seed, the prevenient grace that started, but the seed that was planted in me those many years back, has only taken deeper root and has gotten me to the place of absolute certainty that where God's prophecy unfolds and you see his handiwork, just remember, as I've been repeating this every single week, God is in control, regardless of what it looks like. God is still in control, regardless of what you think might happen. God is still in control. And as I said, looking at this 7th chapter of Revelation tells me God will use those nations, those very nations scattered and dispersed. That tells me one thing, by the way. You know what it tells me? It tells me that as we go towards the end of days, we may be in the last days, and the last days could be 1,000 years, could be, I don't know, whatever the last days are, we're in the period of the last days. But I can tell you what's amazing, that in this period, God will use the very vessels that he scattered upon the earth. He's going to use those very vessels to do the final and last call. That tells me something about God's amazing grace. And if God has grace for those people in that day, he's got abundant grace for you and for me. That's my message. I'm Pastor Melissa Scott, pastor of Faith Center, Glendale, California. I teach every Sunday morning at 11 a.m. If you'd like to attend services with us, simply call the 800 number, that is 800-338-3030, to join us. If you'd like to watch, listen, and learn 24 hours a day, simply log on to our website at www.pastormelissascott.com.